Good afternoon, everyone. Today we have the honor and privilege of having Mr. Mohammed Danish Iqbal with us. Mr. Danish Iqbal will talk on dialogue and ethics of tolerance. Mohammed Danish Iqbal is an assistant professor at the Department of English, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. His areas of interest include literary theory, intersections between literature and history, secularism, etc. You're welcome, Mr. Danish Iqbal. You have up to 3 hours for your session, and you are more than welcome to conduct it however you wish it. You can finish it early as well. So it's totally up to you. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Bazad sir. First of all, I extend and submit my heartfelt gratitude to both the organizations involved in this event. And I feel quite honored that I will be participating in the deliberations that both in Dialogue Foundation and the Gandhi Darshan Samiti are conducting. I will begin by kind of laying the groundwork and some housekeeping before I proceed to make the remarks that I have prepared. First of all, nothing can be more imperative than the understanding that dialogue is not a matter of choice. So I would begin on that note. Just a few disclaimers. If at any point my voice reaches you distorted, or if you find any background disturbance because I can hear vehicles passing by, please do let me know. So what I'm going to do is I have formulated it in the form of a triangular formation, my remarks and my deliberations. As announced by Bazad, that I'll be talking about dialogue and the ethic of secularism. So my talk will touch upon these 3 key terms, that is dialogue, that is ethics or ethic here, and secularism. Tolerance, not secularism, tolerance. And I will be going back and forth, and hopefully by the time I have finished talking, we will have some substantial set of questions to think over collectively. So my first part of deliberation is devoted to unpack the character of dialogue, right? And what does not only this word, but what is the content and the force of this word? So how do we understand? How do we go on to unpack and take part in this enterprise that we call dialogue? So while drawing upon 2-3 philosophers or broadly theorists of the 20th century, I'll be underlining both the nature and the content of this category, a concept that we call dialogue. Then I'll move on to talk about the idea of ethics, right? And probably both dialogue and ethics, I will fashion them in a rather intertwined manner. And in the final move, I will, having deliberated upon, or at least having flagged some of the important aspects of these 2 strands of my deliberation, I'll move on to talk about the analytical challenges involved in tolerance. And why tolerance? So I fully respond to that question satisfactorily as well. That why have I chosen tolerance as a subject of our deliberation? And I'll do that in the light of what has already been discussed regarding dialogue and ethics. Now, I'm sure nobody is new. All of us have some idea. So I will keep the talk probably spanning 45 minutes, an hour, or maybe a little bit over that. And then I won't consider my deliberations over, because then I will invite all of us together to deliberate over or to share your reflections of the readings that I circulated earlier. I'm sure you have seen those readings, even if cursorily. I'm sure you have gleaned some of the foremost ideas that they could trigger in you. And I have chosen those readings primarily because, to my mind, in the context within which I am placing my conversation, those two happen to be the most hotly contested as well as the contentious, the contentions, so to speak, which place each of us, voluntarily, involuntarily. Nobody's outside of it, to be honest. So let's get started. I hope I'm audible. So let's think about this term dialogue. And a practice that I kind of incorporate as a teacher in my classes here is, now class, please pardon me if I give those vibes. I'm not conducting a lecture here. In fact, I had also replied to Bazad in one of those emails. I said that, I'm just as excited as anyone else, and I look at it as an opportunity to probably learn more from you than what I can offer. Nonetheless, so pedagogically speaking, one of the things which I have found useful is whenever we come across a term or a concept or a category, and if we are made to understand that what this or that means, let's take a step back and remind ourselves of any of the concepts and ideas that we may have encountered for the first time. And we are laboring over it, right? So how do we go about it? And at what point, or conceptually speaking, in what form do we consider it understood in relation to how we, or in relation to when we found it to be new, right? So the journey for a concept from being a puzzle to being resolved, each of us have our own personal ways of negotiating that journey. But one of the flip sides of teaching is that we have some uniform standards, ideas. We have certain, decisive ways in which we mark certain things understood or not understood. My experience has been that we can only begin to appreciate the content of a concept once you talk about it, once you begin to talk about it from the perspective of yourself. That is, for example, if I'm new to physics and the teacher broaches the topic of gravitation, I do not know what it means, but I may have come across a passing reference to this somewhere, maybe in a commercial, maybe in a film, maybe in the jokes that my friends crack among themselves. I feel that in all these moments, even in the distortions with which an idea or a concept circulates, it situates us, and gradually it comes to a point that willy-nilly we do have a repertoire. I mean, we form a repertoire within which we place it, unconsciously maybe. And when we are called upon to reflect upon something which we are faintly familiar with, or which we are trying to get through, they come back. And I have noticed, both in myself and the students, that it's a very careful negotiation between what can be articulated and what cannot be articulated. And this is where the context within which we are kind of submitting ourselves to proclaim that we have understood something or we haven't, that plays a very important role. So a student may respond very differently in a classroom than how he would at home or maybe among his friends, responding to the very same idea or concept. So dialogue, we can all remind ourselves that how we began to think about it, or how we began to know about it, or how it has, for me personally, dialogue in the vernacular is always something which is considered uh, or stuff of, let me put it differently, that it can be a very biting word, right? But as you move along, I mean, as I kind of jog my memory, and once you are faced with literature in its various genres and forms, then it appears very differently. And as you go along, as students of humanities and social sciences, it comes to a point that dialogue is the very stuff of our existence, right? There are several theorists and philosophers who one can talk about who have reflected upon the quote unquote dialogic imagination, the dialogic character of the self. But I'm going to mention two here. And among the people who one could recall in this context, who have very powerfully made contributions, or gradually who have gained a rather some critical currency when it comes to understanding dialogue, is the scholars, the philosophers who have emerged from the shadow of the Nazi regime and who seek their lineage to the Jewish ancestry. I'm talking about in the contemporary times. Of course, the entire Plato is, in fact, much of the Greek philosophy is in the form of dialogues. Tragedies have been written in the form of dialogues. Epics have been written in the form of dialogues. But dialogue in itself as a conceptual phenomenon which provides critical energy to the understanding of self and other is something that is very vibrantly present in the 20th century Western critical tradition. So I'll justify why I have gone for these two. The first is, again, a very well-known Russian thinker, Mikhail Bakhtin. I'm going to very briefly kind of characterize his idea. I'm not going to get into the details. Just an aside, the reason I'm looking abstractedly at the walls is that I can't see anyone. So please pardon me if I appear to be looking into the space. I've toggled and I can probably see a few faces. Thank you. And that makes the conversation a little more, I would say, fertile. Anyway, so Bakhtin is talking about the dialogic imagination, and he's taking the root of language and how language is reworked or worked upon in order to compose a text, right? And this emerges in his remarks on the works of Dostoevsky, uh, where he says that much of, novels as they are written, he uses the word polyphonic, heteroglossia, and dialogism. So these are three key terms which we uh, learned from um, Bakhtin. So one is the imagination of monologism, and the other is the imagination of dialogism. So the monologism is, you can say, a voice that not only dominates, but also anchors itself as the voice which will place other voices. In other words, it is the voice that comes to occupy the status of consciousness, in other words, right? And by occupying that place of consciousness, it either demystifies other voices or renders them irrelevant or severely, you would say, limited in its mandate, right? Now, I'm giving you a very watered down version of what he's saying, but I'm not trying to be guided more by his reflections on literature, because these remarks that Bakhtin has made, they can be expanded and projected on the very idea of discourse, right? The whole gamut of conversation, exchanges, building up of ideas, dismantling of ideas, the bitter exchanges as well as exchanges of affection. That and all the exchanges at all sides in their varying shapes and their varying contours, they go on to constitute the discursive framework. So with that in the background, Bakhtin makes a lot more sense. On the other hand, dialogism, which uh, has gained a lot of attention from several scholarly provinces of language, literature, philosophy, it lends credence to the multiplicity of voices, right? And it does not allow the primacy of that one conscious voice over other voices or perspectives, whatever you want to say. In doing so, it might look like a very democratic thing or a democratic idea. But we have to understand, abstractly speaking, we have to understand this tension between the idea of reductionism to sameness, that is one, and the opening up, the in some sense, a certain kind of diffusion, So much of the deliberations over the last at least 2 centuries on ideas that traverse human sciences broadly, that is to literature, philosophy, language, etc. They are moving between these two poles. That is, how these grand comprehensive ideas, they reduce the polyphony, the multiplicity. In other words, they reduce the others to that sameness or seek to do so, right? As against the radical pluralism. Now, when I say radical pluralism, that also generates an anxiety. And the anxiety is anyone who is even cursorily aware of the, the major trends in the human sciences or philosophy would be aware that uh, there are broadly two modes of thinking that have come to be, that you can categorize purely for, as a convenient exercise. I'm not uh, categorizing them. I won't call them, but a foundationalist way of thinking and an anti-foundationalist way of thinking. So the Enlightenment thought, the logical positivism, anything that lies between them is primarily looked at as a foundational way of thinking. But 19th century, Nietzsche as the highest, as a flashpoint in 19th century, following Heidegger, etc., and the whole continental tradition, uh, they are thinking and writing, deliberating in the vein of anti-foundationalism or broad, or to put it mildly, anti-realism. It's where they question the very status of the medium with which you think, with which you work. Now, what is Bakhtin doing here? So that's why we also have to be very careful while talking about a certain radical pluralism, right? Uh, so Bakhtin is talking about the dialogical character of language and how he also uses a phrase which, if some of you would be interested in, can look up. He calls it speech genres, right? So any word or phrase, he's saying, that is used, uh, it has a compositional moment, right? And uh, the dialogic character is deeply related to that speech genres, the compositional moment of the language. In what particular moment, in what particular context, at what particular moment has it been used? That also adds to the polyphony of the language. Anyone who's working with the idea of dialogue, or even the most fundamental understanding of dialogue, implies that there is more than one, right? And this more than one is what we are going to call the self and the other, the I and you, I and thou. So dialogue happens between these two nodes of the continuum, that is I and thou. And one of the major names, one of the famous names that one could recall again, and I'm doing that in passing, I'm not going to deliberate much, but he is someone whose work I/thou, Martin Buber, is much talked about in terms of the constitution of I only in the form of a relationship. But the philosopher who I found of greater importance to our purposes is, or to my purposes, until I've heard from you, I can't really make that claim, is Levinas. So Emmanuel Levinas was another Jewish philosopher, a thinker of Jewish descent, who uh, he wrote much of his philosophy in the 20th century, and I would say that over the last few decades, he has really surfaced as a major thinker uh, of this self-other dichotomy. Now, I should avoid using the word dichotomy because he is the thinker who radically refashions this I-thou relationship, because he does so by first making a claim, and this is a bold claim to make in 20th century, that each of us, or human beings, all of us, we are fundamentally ethical beings, right? Now, it may sound like a very simple statement to make, but it presumes a lot, right? It's a normative statement. It states something as a fact that if we are fundamentally, before anything, before we are what we think we are ethical beings, right? And what does it mean? What does it mean to be ethical? What is ethics? What does it do? Hmm? And why is it nearly impossible to sustain a dialogic thought or a dialogical thought uh, without thinking about ethics? Now, this is one thing I would like to emphasize. To my mind, it is impossible to talk about dialogue without fashioning its essentially ethical character. And it is essentially ethical because ethics also involves how you relate to the other. Or let me leave out the how part. It involves the relation to the other, right? So as you can see, the dialogic imagination, it flows in some sense from the idea of ethics, right? Now, uh, Levinas is making a lot of claims, but I'm going to mention and throw light on some of those claims. One is that by talking about men or human beings as men, women, everyone, human beings, I'm sorry, it should be by primarily calling them as or attributing an ethical character, he is uh, also suspending a lot of other ideas around the self and the other, right? That is, all the constructivist thought around the I, all the self-sustained, reductively rational agent around I, but he's not abandoning them, he's leaving them out. Because as we proceed, we find that Levinas is a thinker who borrows both from the analytical tradition and the continental tradition. That is, some bit of the foundational thought, most dominantly Kantian thought, and of course, there are traces of the continental thought. Anyhow, so let me come to the bare ideas themselves, and I hope that I can explain them satisfactorily enough. And we can we can come back to these reflections again, but just by way of laying them before you. Uh, he's saying that the human condition is intrinsically a social condition. All right. So, in the first move, by identifying human condition as social condition, he's already infused quotient of relation, of a relational nature of the human condition, right? And then he goes on to say that all totalities, all grand ideas, comprehensive theories, comprehensive ideas, comprehensive worldviews, uh, they reduce the other to the same, right? And in this dominant form of reductionist thought, it makes everything subjective. Now, even if what I'm saying seems too abstract, please bear with me for now, because once I illustrate them with the example of some ideas that we find in the liberal regime or the liberal thought, liberalism, I'm sure that they will come alive to you. Then, and having identified everyone as an ethical being, he's also characterizing ethics, right? So, ethics for Levinas is self-grounded. That is, the prescriptive element of ethics and the descriptive element of ethics, they can't be separated, right? And he's doing this much like some other moral philosophers like Bernard Williams too, and they call it thick concepts. But let's not get into that. Let's just remember that after a host of critique uh, of ethics in the 19th and 20th century. So to briefly kind of mention those major critiques, I hope, I'm sure some of you may have heard or read, or in fact read yourself a 19th century Danish philosopher called Kierkegaard, right? Soren Kierkegaard is someone who is always mentioned when it comes to theistic existentialism. That is an existentialism that is flowing from the relationship with God, right? So a critique of ethics from Kierkegaardian critique could be that all ethics is subservient to this overarching relationship, which is between the self and divine, right? Similarly, think about Marx. When Marx is calling the I, the individual, the self, as a member of the species being, he also goes on to consider ethics or ethics as an expression of the economic condition, right? So that is another critique of ethics. Or, for example, Darwin, right? In his Origins of Species, he is talking about the idea of natural selection and how the mite gets to survive, right? So that is another overarching critique of ethics. Or later on, you have Nietzsche, who is talking about the cultural values which are relational, and even Freud, who again brings it down to the superego and the desires that it kind of engages. Now, 20th century, you have a sudden explosion of thought, which is more interested in, you can say, a structural approach. But let's not spend too much time. Let's come back to Levinas. Let me just mention enough that even historiography, a modern discipline which records history, what does it do? It also imputes a certain degree of cultural relativism, right? That how the cultural relativism uh, implies that certain values are only true for certain cultures, right? So history writing brings that to light, right? Now let's see what Levinas is doing. Levinas is doing what Levinas is saying is uh, since ethical or ethics is its own ground, you know, that allows him to critique the hegemony of these totalizations. And by by critiquing these hegemonic imagination of this relationship, the ethical relationship, by emptying it of these motivations, he initiates or introduces uh, an idea which he is calling particularity of the self and the other. So the self and the other, they are particular. There's certain particularity. So all the self, the I and you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Could
Yes, you
someone
are.
please confirm?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
you are
Okay,
audible.
thank you. Uh, So, yeah, thank you. And this, by infusing this idea of, or initiating this idea of particularity to self and the other, uh, he is calling this encounter between I and thou, I and you, an event. You know, there is so instead of going into the question of value, he's calling it an event, and this encounter between I and you, that has to be understood as a certain ethical imperative. So social interaction uh, for Levinas, which he uh, expresses by this phrase which is often associated with him, face to face. So this face to face encounter is at the heart of Levinasian ethics. So what is face to face? So he asserts that this ethics which he's talking about, it occurs or it comes into manifests between every or two particular persons in terms of their face-to-face encounter. And there is no imagination of self outside of this encounter. All right. So self and other, they are bound by the ethic of responsibility, what he calls the ethic of responsibility. So the self in the primary, in the first moment, is obliged towards the other, even before, he is more given to the other before he knows what he has to do. All right. And this character of self in Levinas is what creates a paradoxical, but which he calls a dialectical relationship between a plea and command. So the other makes a plea and a command at once. I'll come back to this again, this plea and command interplay between plea and command in Levinas. So this is universal, and this is where he is drawing from the foundational tradition of thinking, the foundationalist philosopher, by calling it universal, by not radically relativizing it. So, first of all, by pluralizing the self, the position of the self, and yet not lapsing into some radical relativization, Levinas is bringing together these two modes of yes. Yes. Shall I continue, or if there
No,
is
it
some?
was just a background noise. Somebody's microphone was on. You please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Now let's think about the ethical content and the force of this encounter, right? So the authority and the normative force of ethical in Levinas. Now let me explain what does authority mean. So authority would mean what is the status of ethical, right? So he would say the status of ethical is the dominant reason to act, right? So it acts as an imperative. So this is what this would be the status of the ethical in our lives, in our everyday lives, right? And what is the normative force? So normative is the term that they generally use when it in other words could mean something that is ought to be done, something that is ought to be done, which should be done, which but why do we call it normative? Why? Because it also it has an organizational impetus, so it organizes our life. So all of us live by certain normative standards. For example, in this interaction, since all of you know that I am talking, so the rest of us should sit back and listen. So this is a certain normative understanding which is at play, right? And it has a certain force of its own, right? Which is kind of allowing both of us to operate by these normative standards, right? And this is what Levinas is calling that the normative force of the ethical in our lives. Now, so the three ideas that we have to keep in mind is the particularity of the person, this force, the ethical force that the face-to-face encounter carries with itself. But the particularity of the self does not lie in itself, right? It is utterly particular only in the encounter with the other. So both the self and the other, they have this particular character, the particularity, what he calls utterly particular, only in this encounter, this face-to-face encounter. Now, what is this face? Now, he is using face in several of his works, like in Totality, in Infinity, etc. But for him, face represents the highest expression, so to speak. So, and this face is not only a physical face. It is also the presence in this world, how we are given to this world. So, let's understand it. Let me rephrase it. So we have the self-other intertwining, this intertwining is, for Levinas, the primary moment of our existence. All right? So we cannot imagine, or fashion the self outside this INU relationship, the self and the other relationship. And this relationship is a relationship of what he calls responsibility. Now, all of this, probably I'm lacking in adequate explanation. Otherwise, he's not making it an altruistic encounter. It's not as if it's a relationship of care, or of course it is that, since it is ethical. But it is made up of that. You have to understand it like this, that this responsibility is a demand that the other places on the self, right? It commands that from the self. And it is also a plea that you find in the other when it is faced with you, when the self is faced with the other, right? And what he calls the nudity, the vulnerability of the face. Now, how all of this, not all of this is a grand mumbo jumbo. So we also have to keep in mind that we are here to understand that how do these deliberations on developing a critical understanding of dialogue, how can it help us negotiate the knotty, thorny questions of differences, right? And so just bear with me in this bit, since I'm talking about a slightly complex ethical and dialogic character. When we move on to the idea of tolerance, I'm sure you will see its relevance there. So when one encounters the face of the other, it makes a claim, right? And that claim arises out of the person's need, dignity, etc. And the face of the other, it speaks with authority, right? Now, this has to be understood outside the status of the self and the other, as weaker or stronger, as superior or subjugated, right? That part is there. He's not whitewashing this. He's not circumventing the question of justice, but he's trying to establish it extensively enough that in the primary moment we are all in a relationship with the other, right? And this dialogue continues, right? Even those who, let's think about it, even those, for example, if you have a friend and you request the friend to go out and have on a cup of coffee, or go out and watch a film with you. Now, if you go and request the person and he agrees to come with you, you will probably attribute it to your friendship, right? But more importantly, according to this Levinasian template, whether he agrees, disagrees, comes along, makes you feel happy, he calls them veils, V-E-I-L, veils of decency, right? And what does it veil? It veils that relationship. It veils, so it is not in itself the relationship. In itself, the relationship is that of the self and other. In itself, and how your friend conducts yourself around you, it veils that relationship. You understand? So it is at a very primary level, he is, in fact, calling us an ethical being who is always caught in this relationship with the other, right? So, and he says that we are always responsible, for all others, and uh, our obligation to others, they in fact prevail over uh, any interest or value that we have, right? So what do we see here? That he has radically emptied it of any hidden values, so to speak. I mean, it is ethical just because it is an act of particular encounter with the other, right? Unlike, for example, the other critiques that we kind of saw earlier. So, what we find in our day-to-day lives, in the encounter when we are facing the other, when we are face to face with the other, are these particular revelations, what he calls particular revelations. So what do we discover is not some idea or value, and I'm quoting it here. It is the presence and my responsibility, right? So in everyday life situations, it is the facing the other is the presence and my responsibility, which the other person claims upon me, right? And all of this, mind you, this is the most important part. All of this which he has said is true about me before anything else, right? And so this is what is true about me inviolably, right? It can't be, it can't be nullified in any sense before anything else can be truly said about me, right? So this relatedness, is always veiled by decencies and formalities and acrimonies and disputes, and you want to call it. So he's going beyond the idea of conventional idea of relationship to in fact attribute a deeper understanding of relationship, right? And so the other is what I am in myself not, right? And this will play out. Probably you can sense some resonances of this in the two dialogues that I had circulated between Gandhi and Ambedkar, and Mulk Raj Anand and Ambedkar. So we'll come to see that how do these resonate with what we have read there. So so relation to other is an encounter in Levinasian thought, which is prior to and irreducible to any comprehension or thought, right? So relation to other, it precludes any comprehension. In other words, it precludes any language. It precludes any discourse, which he calls discourse before discourse, right? So I hope I'm clear here. So this relationship to other is not mediated by language, is not mediated by any ideology, is not erected by any ideology. It's not an offshoot of some understanding of language. So by precluding, or in other words, by being prior to language, it is being prior to discourse, which he calls discourse before discourse, right? So in this way, that is a very revolutionary thought. Why? Because first of all, much of the dominant deliberations around self, language, community, society is guided by by a certain constructivist strain of thought, and it has anti-foundationalism built into it, but not here. What we find is a very original idea, which uh, is also bold, I would say, in the scholarly environment within which he has pushed through these ideas, right? And it is the moral religiosity of this relationship which he calls religion, right? So he is, of course, inspired by the Jewish thought, but he's not talking about the organized, institutionalized religion when he calls this fact, this everyday encounter is what he calls a fact event, and since it is imbued with such deep ethical character, he calls it a religion, right? Which is not some grand idea or doctrine or institutionalized principle, but the very ethical nature of this primary character is what makes the moral religiosity of this encounter religious, right? So that, in that sense, and these are just two final remarks regarding Levinas, and then I'll move on to tolerance. Is it okay if I speak for, I'm close to an hour right now, maybe another 15, 20 minutes? Should be okay, I guess.
I think it's fine. Yes.
Yeah, I know it's pretty tedious to just sit back and listen, but yeah, bear with me. That's all I can say. So the next remark that I would like you to bear in mind is that this makes each of us a moral presence, right? And a thick moral presence, which is self-grounded. As I had said earlier, the commentary that I was reading on Levinas, it had also mentioned another example which probably can make things a little easier to relate, about another philosopher, Stanley Cavell. Now, I've not read Stanley Cavell, but I can share with you what I read there about him. That he has a concept of acknowledgement, that acknowledgement is what brings the two together. So he's saying that consider the difference between saying, I am in pain, and on the other hand, saying, I know you are in pain, right? So what brings the two statements together? In the other statement, you are showing or expressing sympathy, which is an act of acknowledgement, right? And he's saying that it is the act of acknowledgement which essentially, I won't say brings the two together, but essentially binds us, or essentially kind of, I would say, structures the self. Now, the other person might refuse it. He might refuse the sympathy, or she might refuse what you're saying. You might just as well say that you have no idea, you have no clue what I'm going through. So, or you might even affirm, thank you, for being there. But in both these cases, acknowledgement has been performed, right? Acknowledgement has been enacted. And what Levinas is saying is that prior to any comprehension or prior to any thought about oneself, we are in a relation as part of that encounter. So that relational aspect to the self is irreducible, is inviolable. It is essentially what marks the eye. Sorry. And so the idea of face-to-face is, in that sense, a targeted dependence. It is not. It is not merely that you are making a plea, but it is inevitably necessary. It fulfills what one is. It is what makes one what one is in the very first move itself. All right, so maybe the rest of it can be taken up when I have finished my conversation. Now let me turn to right. I'll just take a moment to have a sip of water. Thank you. So, again, tolerance is probably, if not the most, but one of the most used terms for all of us. Somebody has turned intolerant, or someone is complaining of intolerance, is something which all of us have been bombarded with, right? So, I mean, socially speaking, politically speaking, all of us are walking on this, performing this tightrope walk, lest one is accused of being intolerant or even complaining of intolerance. So very quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flesh out the understanding of tolerance in liberal democracy. And I'm going to share with you two very important critiques that have emerged recently. Although they differ among themselves, but they, of course, enrich our understanding of tolerance. And then I would invite all of you to think about these in the light of the short essays and interviews that I shared with you earlier. So, tolerance is considered the cornerstone of liberal polity, right? And this is what marks liberal politics. So, if somebody is intolerant, he can't be a liberal. He or she can't be a liberal, right? He has no claim to be to liberalism. So, liberalism, in that sense, invites you to inculcate the ability to sustain conflicting thoughts, right? To entertain thoughts which are inimical, based on the larger principle of coexistence, of amity, of whatever name you want to give it. But you get the gist, the drift of that argument. But over the last 100 years, particularly ever since or in the aftermath of the post-war years, much like all these, the other Enlightenment principles, tolerance also came under a very sustained scholarly scrutiny. So let's think about the different moments, contexts within which we use this word, right? The moment you say tolerant, you're also a tolerance you also get reminded of the terms, cognate terms like tolerant, intolerant, toleration, tolerated, etc. And they are different. Each of them are slightly different from each other, from the other. So I'm going to pursue the understanding of toleration and probably bring to a point where we know what do we mean when we say that someone is tolerant and the other is intolerant, right? So how toleration operates as a discursive exercise, which creates this web of power relation where it situates one as tolerant and the other as intolerant. Now, is it a benign virtue? To be tolerant, is it a benign virtue? Of course it is, right? So let me, at the very outset, create a distinction between the two ways in which I'm going to use it. In our daily lives, we do not like a lot of things. You don't like a crowded bus. You don't like to be shoved around. You don't like to find yourself among co-passengers who are talking in a certain way, who might be munching their food in a way that is crunchy sound, and they might be loud, and they could be doing a number of things. But this is it's the principle of tolerance which helps us negotiate these moments of displeasure, dislike, etc. But this is a matter of individual disposition. What I'm going to talk about is how tolerance operates as an idea, right? How tolerance operates discursively, and it enables a particular kind of politics within which one has to be tolerant and the other has to be intolerant, right? And this hierarchical relationship where uh, there is a tolerant and there is someone who is tolerated, right? So, what's the difference between the tolerant and tolerated? How does tolerant prevail over the tolerated, etc.? There's a German political philosopher, Rainer Forst, who has made some very interesting contribution to this debate lately. Although all of us know in classical political philosophy, John Locke's essay on toleration is something, anyone who deliberates over tolerance has to deal with that essay in modern political thought, John Locke's essay concerning toleration. But Rainer Forst is interesting because he has, what he does is, first of all, as I said, I'm not talking about personal quirks that you dislike. But that does not mean to say that, let's say, disliking a passenger who speaks to somebody, a co-passenger, who calls someone up and speaks to the other person using the speaker on the phone. Now, that might seem very disturbing to a lot of people around, but you tolerate, or maybe at best you just try to be indifferent. Now, we have to understand that this is not outside politics. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the principle of tolerance goes much beyond that. And in withstanding unpleasant situations, tolerance is also preparing us for something more, right? And let's try to unpack what is that something more. What do we tolerate? We tolerate that which does not sit well with us, right? We tolerate that which, if I have to put it bluntly, which according to you or me is bad, is disagreeable, which I wish wasn't true, which I wish weren't existing, right? This is what I tolerate. If that is not the case, then I'm not tolerating. I may be indifferent, So if I'm indifferent, I'm not tolerating. I'm tolerating that which in the first place I wish did not exist, right? Uh, which is bad, to put it very bluntly, which according to my moral universe is bad. So the first, what Rainer Foss does, he has identified three distinct components to the idea of toleration. The first of which I've just shared with you, that it is bad, that it is something which I don't like, right? The next component is that of acceptance. Now, even though it is bad, even though it does not agree with what I believe, even though it does not go along with how I would ideally like, so you please understand that I have a set of reasons to not like something, right? Now let's say those set of reasons, the set of reasons has X, Y, Z, 3 reasons, or maybe 100 reasons. Now, the acceptance component of toleration, it stands alongside these sets of reasons, right? Due to which I do not like something, but it tips the balance in the favor of toleration. Even though I do not like this, since the reasons for me not liking is not strong enough, I will tilt towards tolerance. I hope I am clear here. Now, the third component is what he calls rejection, right? Now, this is at the limits of the tolerance, where the reason for me to stand alongside is not strong enough in comparison to the reasons due to which I object. I hope I'm clear, right? So in that sense, the balance tilts and I reject it. And in that moment, I am intolerant towards that particular subject or event or person, right? So I would also like you to keep in mind that how tolerance, as it operates, it creates that subject position for both the tolerant and the tolerated, right? And the subject position belongs to the tolerant. Now, these are three components he's saying, right? Now and then he has two conceptions of tolerance. So what's the difference between components and conceptions? So the conception is how does tolerance function, right? So one of those concepts is permission concept, where Rainer Foss says that imagine a group, an individual or a group or a community or several communities, whichever you want to imagine. It wants to live its life or their life based on their principle, which goes against the larger shared principles, right? In other words, we're talking about a smaller group of people, a minority, an insignificant group, or several insignificant groups. And in other words, they are not in position to be as they want. So the permission concept of tolerance would be when the dominant party or the dominant group sets a framework, within which the smaller group, the minor group, are allowed to live, right? So they're tolerated, but at the same time, they're also stigmatized, right? So they're tolerated, but they're at the mercy. But the terms and conditions are set by this larger dominant group, right? So in that sense, they are tolerated, but once again, this tolerance legitimizes intolerance, right? It legitimizes by stigmatization, it legitimizes the intolerance. Now, with various democratic revolutions and with democratic evolution, what he calls the contemporary, a major part of the social political world in contemporary times, he says it operates on the respect conception of tolerance. So what is respect conception as against the permission concept? So the respect concept is a horizontal concept, where despite disagreements on the idea of a good life that each of us envision for ourselves as an individual or a group, we come to an agreement that we will create certain institutions and principles which will go beyond our moral universe, and they will, our sanction to pursue our good life will flow from those standards, right? So this framework will be impersonal. Our moral universe will remain intact. We will be private individuals or groups to pursue what we like, what we believe is the correct way of being, but the framework within which we would do that would be impersonal. That is, it will be beyond what each of these discrete. So modern institutions, roughly speaking, they promise to work like it. Whether they do or not is, I leave it to you for you to make that assessment. So in principle, this is what we agree to do. So in that sense, tolerance is a virtue that of tolerating belief, ideas, opinions which you do not agree with, but they do not violate any principles, and that's how they reflect the equality and freedom. So one of the important aspects of this latter conception, that is the respect conception, is that I also guarantee each of us in this covenant, we also guarantee each other the moral right to exist, right? To pursue your own idea of a good life, which is a major departure from the earlier conception, right? So this is what Rainer Foss thinks is in circulation now. And very quickly, about 5 minutes from now, I'll finish. The other important intervention, critical intervention, who has also critiqued these positions, but I want to skip the criticism of Rainer Faust and get straight away into the formulations by another political philosopher, Wendy Brown. She's a political philosopher at Columbia, if I'm not wrong. And she wrote this wonderful book called Regulating Aversion. So she's her interest is, how does tolerance operate as a discourse in modern democracies, right? And she's saying that a very worrying sign has emerged as tolerance circulates in modern democracy, liberal democracy, on account of tolerance naturalizing conflicts and differences, right? So we have to understand in the principle, maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, that tolerance emerges only when there is a difference. As I said, bad, good, bad, this distinction between good and bad. So is it a trope to manage difference? Does tolerance merely manage difference? as against tolerance addressing difference, right? And Rainer Faust, when he's talking about the respect conception, the permission conception, he echoes and he quotes all of you must have heard of Goethe, the German author. He said that to tolerate is to insult unless it also leads to recognition, right? So it is borrowing on those ideas that Rainer Faust has made these formulations. Now, let's consider a little more that what Wendy has to say. So Wendy says that, for example, she's giving examples from the classrooms in the United States, of schools in the United States. And she says when teachers have to discuss racial differences, for example, so instead of saying, by playing up the principle of tolerance, are they papering over the history of those differences? Or that how one set of people came to be dominant over the other, right? So by attributing or the ethical imperative, all of it on the idea of tolerance, do we essentialize these differences? That they are as such and you have to tolerate. You know what I'm saying? So by imputing this essential character to all the nodes of differences, does tolerance, in other words, essentialize those differences? Sorry. And an after effect could be that does it naturalize conflicts, right? By drawing attention to ways in which you can merely sustain each other, are you on the averse also naturalizing those conflicts, and as an extension also essentializing certain attributes, right? So, to give you an example, I'm sure this is true for all of us, and I'm being very frank here, that there must have been many occasions in our lives when we would have remarked in our own languages that that's how they are. You know, now this idea of that is how someone is, aisa hi hota hai ye sab, you know, like that's how we say, that's how they are. Now, when you take that statement and if you think about it, what are you doing? So you are in that moment immediately projecting your disagreement with an idea onto the identity. And this is happening through tolerance, that you take the belief for identity, right? And that is why tolerance becomes one of the most potent grounds on which things from neighborhood relations to the international relations are articulated. So that's how they are. They are despots. We have to correct them, right? Let's not bother about. So we are not looking at the ideas, and we are merely looking at the identity. This is what tolerance also, in fact, affects. And by tolerance also, now let's go back to the previous example. When you are traveling and you come across something which you do not like, or you are invited by someone to do something and you do not like, just give me a second. Sorry. So which you do not like. Now, attributing a historical difference to personal dislike is also something which tolerance allows us to perform, right? So a difference which has power relations associated with it. when it is reduced to idea of personal taste, as if personal taste is a work of magic. Personal taste is not a work of magic. It is also taking shape within a particular context, right? So it immediately depoliticizes the choices that we make. It immediately depoliticizes those conflicts, those differences, right? And finally, as I said, it essentializes cultures, identities, and in doing so, even when I'm kind of rushing through it because I think I have overshot what I had targeted. So I'll just end with this one more aspect of what tolerance does is at the individual level, when an individual essentializes the difference that he or she finds with others, and at the level of the state. Now I'm saying this with a lot of care because it's something which we find all around us, that when a state adopts the policy of tolerance, it also chooses the candidates of tolerance. That is, it chooses and it slots who are capable of being tolerant and who aren't. Right? So, tolerance in that sense points to these, discursive maneuvers, and it is informed by these power relations, uh, which it also very beautifully hides or conceals. Now, why am I talking about it? I'm not saying that tolerance is a bad thing or is a virtue that we should not practice. I'm not saying any of that. What I'm saying is that these discussions they draw our attention to how best can we combine the ethical character of being with the burden of difference. So, and this is where our thought experiment will begin. So, I have kind of shared with you rather elaborately the conceptual tools with which I'm thinking here. Now, the object of thinking is what I have shared with you already, circulated. So, the two most the most contentious flashpoints that we find in our social and political life is along the line of religion and caste, right? So let's remain focused on that. And you find that there are two different notions of managing difference in uh, what we call the Nehruvian vision and the Gandhian vision. Okay, I can see a group of people on my screen. Who are they praying or are they playing? Anyhow, so I think I'll stop here, but I would stop by saying that please feel free to generate any new strand of discussion. Please add to what I have said. And now I have turned the table. Now I will be on the side of listening. And of course, I would like to listen more from you. And I would urge you to kind of ground your questions in the text that you have read, and please share your reflections. Thank you once again. I I hope that we continue to enrich each other. Yes, over to Behzad. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Danish Iqbal.
Do you
Great talk.
suggest we take a short break, maybe 5 minutes? Is that advisable?
Okay. Yes, okay. As you wish.
Yeah, just to shake off the fatigue that my monotonous conversation might have caused. So maybe we can break for 5 minutes and then we gather again.
Okay. In the meanwhile, the participants can think of the questions or comments that they want to make.
Yeah, so, please do so.
Yeah. So we come back at 16:32.
Yeah, sure.
So who wants to ask a question or comment? Who wants to go first?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll be back. Right, who wants to go first? I know that Nitya wants to ask a question, but anybody else before her? Nitya, why don't you go
Okay.
first?
Yes, yes. Yeah. Hi, sir. Thank you so much for this lecture. And especially the first part was so philosophical. It has really it has answered a lot of my questions, which had generated over the course of, I mean, over the period of this course, while engaging with the idea of otherness and the relationship we share with the other being so central in that conception. So sir, my question is about that you said that in a primary moment we all exist in a relationship with other, and that is where we are so ethically grounded. So I'm also a bit reflecting on my own understanding of it. And you further on stated that every response is then a veil. I mean, of course, coming from Levinas' explanation, and that itself veils the relationship. So, sir, it is here I would want some clarification. So, I'm a student of psychoanalysis, and I employ psychoanalysis as a literary critical theory to understand the text. So, where, sir, even Lacan talks about that language has so much of a function to disguise things more than it reveals. So, there is always a possibility of some sort of a missing text or a space where new meaning can be created. So this idea of veiling, do you think it sounds more like an avenue of a mistrust, maybe, that perhaps in my
Agony. I'm sorry, did you
mis,
say agony?
no, not agony, an avenue of mistrust
Avenue.
somewhere? Yeah, like, is that the possibility? Then how do we understand our engagement, even while reading, say, for instance, the conversation between Ambedkar and Gandhi? I don't know how one will understand it. To me, sort of it appeared that it was so much of veiling of the otherness somewhere of the other. Like there was not an engagement because Gandhi was, he had his own ideas about the representation of the caste in the constitution. Ambedkar was arriving from a very different conjecture. So was it like a failure of dialogue, or in that itself, like in that incomplete dialogue, emerged a new discourse of knowledge? So my clarification that I'm seeking is more in terms of this notion of veiling when it comes to response, say at the level of behavior or language. So how do we make sense of that? I think that is where the friction appears, or a lot of misunderstanding also gets created.
Okay. Well, you think I should respond with that, or should we take more questions?
You can address this one, and we can
Okay.
take more.
Yeah. So I am not first of all in my presentation. I'm not looking for a resolution. I don't have a resolution. All right. But I'm just trying to flesh out the probably new ways of understanding this difference. Okay, so let me come back to the moment that you have mentioned. First of all, Levinasian idea of encounter is it precludes everything, even the Lacanian suppositions. Okay. If you remember that conversation between Ambedkar and Gandhi, and a very dramatic conversation there, and the description says that had Gandhi not looked at him a moment further, he would have left. You know, so he was talking to someone else, then he turns to Ambedkar and he addresses him, and that's when the conversation begins. And there comes a moment where, almost like a very tragic moment in that sense, that Ambedkar announces, I have no homeland, right? And Gandhi assures him that you have a homeland. Now think about, and in fact, that document says that Gandhi turns to him. In other words, quite literally, he's faced with Ambedkar. And that's when this interaction takes place. And when Ambedkar announces that I have no homeland, and Gandhi assures him that you have a homeland, you have to understand that this dialogue, which is unfolding between the two, is a very not only political in nature, it is also a moment of ethical choices, right? Now, at the risk of sounding that I'm reading Gandhi selectively, because Gandhi's corpus is such that you can read him in any which way you want. He's full of contradictions. A lot of people have commented on that. But in this particular instance, when Gandhi resolutely disapproved of a separate electorate, he is seen to have failed to allow that ethical to inform the political. People have noted that. This is not me saying, right? However, we do not only have to look at this self-other conception in Levinas as a moment of conflict. Levinas is not merely talking about a conflict or an affirmation, whether you love someone or hate someone. No. Levinas is saying that this is a primary character. I can't think of a better phrase. When I say primary character, I mean that all the analysis has to be grounded in this fact about the self. All right? So it isn't as if it's a matter of moral choice whether one talks or not, whether one is in a relationship to the other or not. Rather, what we have to understand is that this interaction between Gandhi and Ambedkar, it underscores the very strong ethical character which makes this conversation possible, right? So both of them are tied into this self-other relationship in ways more than one. Now, whether it conceals something, of course it does. I mean, veiling is not merely to be understood in terms of some hidden value. Veiling is, in other words, that which covers. It does not necessarily hide to be discovered, but that which is in addition to that which exists in its nakedness. So the face represents that nakedness of the self for Levinas. It's the nakedness, it's the vulnerability. And it is only based on the idea of this vulnerability and nakedness that it makes that, or it commands the attention of the other. It makes a plea on the other, right? So we have to look at this conversation between Gandhi and Ambedkar, and I think it will be fruitful to not reduce that encounter to a moment of conflict. Of course, it's a moment of conflict, politically speaking, it's a moment of conflict. But it is also a moment of coming together, right? It's a moment of coming together and establishing, or let's say articulating. So articulating that relation. What I'm struggling with here is to how adequately can I, in fact, express the idea of self and other facing the other in Levinas, which, according to him, precludes everything, even the moment of articulation, right? So, and if you read both the dialogue between Gandhi and Ambedkar and Mulkraj and Anand, you see as against this interaction between Gandhi and Ambedkar, in Mulkraj, Anand and Ambedkar, which seems to be a lot more cordial and easygoing, they both are coming to occupy a new kind of a subject position in the course of that dialogue. So this is what dialogue does, where you are speaking to each other from your distinct positions, and yet you are supplying that ethical energy to the other. So both are other to each other there, and they both are supplying the ethical energy to the other. I would not wade beyond that in the context of Gandhi and Ambedkar for very sound political reasons. So my reason and my purpose behind circulating these interactions was not to make a political point or to highlight a failure or the success of one view over the other. That is a very well known, and all of us are learned enough to make our own opinions. But I was just trying to demonstrate this relationship in action, right? Or to take it further, think about what Nehru has to say and what Gandhi has to say with regards to tolerance. Now, tolerance it assumes importance because tolerance is also based on this idea of difference. The other, the presence of this inimical other, of this other which I am not. And that brings us to Levinas for me. So, on the one hand, if I can remind all of us that Nehru, when he's talking about the problem of intolerance, he is saying, and a very, I would say, a very loaded phraseology there, when he says that only a request can be made, right? If you remember, he says only a request can be made. If someone is consuming or indulging in cow slaughter, or if a group of people are playing music around mosque, he's using these examples. He's saying that even if it hurts you, only a request can be made. Now, who do you make a request with? You make a request. A request also presumes distance, right? Separatedness. And to me, Gandhi shows the way out, right? And this is my reading of the text. I will be very happy and glad to hear from you on this. Gandhi, on the obverse, is not of Nehru's persuasion, which does not mean to say that they are diametrically opposite. Nehru echoes some of Gandhian sentiments, in fact, but Gandhi is resolutely intimate. His politics is politics of intimacy. And this is what makes Gandhi very, very vital for me when it comes to understanding the value of dialogue or the function of dialogue. What is Gandhi saying? Gandhi is not saying that a request has to be made. He is, if you read those entries on tolerance and equality of religions that I had circulated, he's talking about a wonderful idea of imperfection, right? That all of us are imperfect. And he's talking about following religions and religious beliefs, even words of God as they are recorded in certain books that a religion centralizes as its central book, whether Quran or Gita or Bible for that matter. And he says that these are words of God which have undergone distortion or imperfection through the medium of humanity. This is his phrase, right? So how can you mobilize imperfection to call for intimacy? That's a wonderful reworking of imperfection. He's saying we cannot be fighting each other since all of us are imperfect, right? And that's where he grounds his idea of intimacy as against Nehru. Nehru is not getting into value judgments. Nehru is merely saying that we have to make a request and bear whatever comes of it, whether one follows it or not. So, from one pole of tolerance, which maintains that distance, which is the liberal position, that separatedness, that position of difference in its own history, in its own, if one could take it further, one could see, or one could simply say that you are indifferent towards how fully evolved that position is and merely tolerate as it is, as against Gandhi, who is making a very clear judgment that we are imperfect. And the medium of language, very much like Nietzsche is saying, medium of language distorts the word of God. In other words, the imperfection, absence of perfection can be a ground for people to come together. So we have to locate these two visions in the interplay between separatedness and intimacy. And I think, that was one of the reasons why I had put together these two very diverse set of reflections. But I would be glad to hear more from you. Yes, can we move on to, yeah.
Muhammad Baliq now?
Right, sir. Sir, my question is based on what we've discussed regarding tolerance and intolerance. So this is in the context of what is happening in France right now. So if you could tell me what's your take on the tolerance and intolerance debate, and what exactly could demarcate the difference between hate speech and the freedom of speech?
Well,
Freedom of expression, sorry.
These are very loaded questions, but I would not shy away from sharing my opinion. So let me just say it clearly. I think one approach to the problem could be by understanding how tolerance extends the belief to identity in its political role, right? So, and how it disables the other to appreciate the relationship between, to appreciate what the other takes to be a moral injury, right? Now, what I'm going to say now is not my own insight, and I'm saying this based on if some of you are in social sciences, you may have heard of scholars like Sabah Mahmood and Talal Asad, etc., who have made a sterling contribution to the idea of free speech and the liberal self, right? Now, what is happening here, and it goes without saying that no violence can be condoned. So I think all of us are wise enough not to situate what I'm going to say as a way of whether I'm rationalizing the beheadings or not. I'm not, all right? But a more pertinent question is, how do these protesting Muslims, how do they relate to the status of Prophet in their lives? How do you make sense of that? What resources do you have to make sense of that, right? Secondly, is it the injury that these people feel, is it because they feel the Prophet has been humiliated, or their relationship to the Prophet has been humiliated? You understand? So this relationship to the Prophet it rests on an entirely different set of terms and conditions, right? And this humiliation, that's why a humiliation to that figure appears to be a humiliation to your own self, a moral self, right? Free speech, freedom of expression, tolerance, all of these are loaded terms, and they are not circulating in an abstract, humanless world, right? So they are performing certain functions. As I said in my remarks on tolerance, tolerance also chooses its candidates. Now you may, even if you give a cursory glance at the discourses circulating around you, you will feel that some of people, groups of people, depending on where you are looking at, whether in France or in India or in broadly the Western world or the global South, it depends on how you are looking at it, you would automatically feel, you will immediately be given to this idea that some groups are given to tolerance while others are not, naturally, right? Now, this is not a pre-given difference. According to Wendy Brown, tolerance creates that difference, where one seems more amenable to the idea of tolerance, while the other seems absolutely inimical to the idea of tolerance, right? And uh, any deliberation on the question of freedom of speech or hate speech or hurt sentiments cannot, worth its salt, any deliberation worth its salt, cannot or scarcely afford to discard these aspects to the discussion. This is not open and shut case, which is not to say that people are free to kill each other. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying that is, how do you determine the tolerant and the tolerated? There in itself, a lot of, I would say, power relations are involved. And to end with it, of course, no amount of provocation can justify the violence that it unleashes. No. You have to understand the sense of moral injury, which I also feel. And I also, let me tell you that this idea, and I'm not talking about the beheadings in France or elsewhere, and this is nothing new. We have had these cases earlier. We should also understand that this idea that why don't you write something in reply to something that has been said, right? So this is a very particular, there's it has to be looked at historically, where the sense of injury has been delineated from the power to articulate, right? So if I am more powerful to you, and if I say a few things, bad things, extremely unpleasant things about you, the way it might hurt you, it might not similarly hurt me if you were to say certain things. You know what I'm saying? So that is happening because of the way we are situated. So any articulation or any deliberation, reflection on these questions has to take into account that how are these two nodes of the discussion situated. And then only we can have a more substantial reflection on the question of free speech, etc. I would invite some reflections of your own based on the reading that you may have done. Anyone? I must confess that this is also a first for me to be taking part in a deliberation on dialogue studies. So I was eagerly looking forward to, in fact, hear more from you, since you have had several sessions, and I'm sure you have gathered a lot more than I can offer at this point. So please feel free to go ahead and share your reflections.
Sir, I do not have a question, not with regards to the readings or what you said, but there's it's probably an observation, and it was a link that I made. You made a remark about tolerance essentializing conflict, how it essentializes conflict. If there is no conflict, there won't be tolerance. So I was just, I don't know, a couple of days back, I was reading about conflict transformation and the conflict transformation. And the major contention that the proponent of conflict transformation, Lederach, makes is that he wants us to see conflict, which is a major departure that he takes from other approaches to peace building. He says that conflict should be looked at with a positive connotation, because conflict is the only essential thing to human nature. If there is no conflict, human nature will be discarded, because conflict is very essential. So it's static, and only then will peace be a dynamic if we have conflict. So I was thinking, if we are looking at tolerance as something which essentializes conflict, I mean, tolerance is an outcome of conflict, are we then saying that tolerance is the end product of a transformed conflict? Or is it that tolerance is the stage, it's the precursor to a transformed conflict? I don't know if I have been able to put my point across.
Give me a second.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. So I was saying, are we then saying that the tolerance that we see, is it the end product of a transformed conflict, or is it just a precursor to that transformation? Like, or do we not even see it from that angle?
I couldn't quite follow, what does transformed conflict mean here?
So the context in which I talk about transformed conflict is that its proponent says that you do not look at conflict as something which is negative. He gives a positive connotation to conflict. He says it is the reason why there
It's
is
productive.
productive. It's the reason why there is constructive change in any social conflict. So when you talked about tolerance being essentializing conflict, it somehow clicked that is it that that very tolerance will be the end product of a transformed conflict, or will it just be a precursor to a transformed conflict? I hope it makes sense.
Well, in the context in which I mentioned these formulations around tolerance, that speaks of how tolerance conceals certain historically determined differences. All right. So, for example, let's say colonized colonizer difference, or colonized colonizer relationship. So, if a tolerant French, for example, is engaging with the intolerant Algerian, right? By summoning this virtue of tolerance, then Wendy Brown would say that in that moment, the tolerant French subject is essentializing the difference that Algerian means to him. All right. In other words, by not engaging with him with that position, with Algerian position, for the colonized position, it is circumventing the roots of that conflict, and by repeatedly and there is nothing more mainstream than tolerance, right, in our daily life. So in that sense, tolerance would sustain that difference to the point that it appears to be natural, and the conflict is nothing but natural, and this elides from the scene the inherent power relations in that uh, relationship of difference. So that is what tolerance does. By appearing to be a benign virtue of goodness, right? It also, in a sense, inhibits us from or inhibits the tolerating subject from uh, dealing with it, engaging with it based on the historical differences as it may be. And moreover, furthermore, what does it do? It also situates, so it creates that subject position in the discourse as the one who is tolerant and one who is naturally intolerant. You know what I'm saying? So this pre-givenness to intolerance is also a handiwork of the discourse of tolerance.
Thank you.
And this is why I think Gandhi is very important, because Gandhi is not falling in the trap of this vacuous idea of respect. He is bold enough to just, venture into the intimate recesses of the self, right? And maybe, I didn't want to overwhelm you with the readings, but some readings that reflect on Gandhi's venture into Noakhali, that bring it out even more radically. When Gandhi has the moral force to walk right into the heart of that raging conflict and test the strength of his ethical force that he calls satyagraha, is even more illuminating, I would say. So I don't know if I can satisfactorily respond to the question you raised, but hopefully this will help you process it.
Thank you, sir.
Anybody else?
Sir, this is Sabiha More, and I just went through the material that you sent to us to read, in which Nehru has very extensively talked about tolerance and intolerance as per the readings that you have sent for us to go through. And he has talked about tolerance from only probably religious point of view, in which he says that most of the intolerance situation that occur is because people believe that their religion is different. And he has talked about beef eating, and saying that one cannot have Vinoba Bhave says politics and religion is out of date, in spite of the fact that Vinoba Bhave is a very religious man. My question to this is that what Nehru wrote maybe around 50 years back has all become meaningless in the present context, where religion is absolutely at the periphery of not tolerating each other. Here
Could
in
you
our
repeat
daily
yourself?
life, yeah, means it's at the outer periphery. The center stage of tolerance has taken one's own religion. You look around the world, you look around Africa, you look around probably Iraq, you look around probably Iran, where the religion is same, yet there is so much of intolerance. I was reading about Yazidis a couple of days back, Yazidi tribe in Iraq, where they were massacred, like because they have a different way of understanding God. And they believe that Lalaish is their pilgrimage, and they don't believe in going to Kaaba, and that's how they were. And or probably in Iran, because Shiites are having a particular thought of understanding religion in their way. Why go anywhere else in our own country? A particular religion, let's say Hinduism, and their exponents of different kinds have got different ways of understanding things. So what my question is that has the tolerance in all its sense change its meaning, shade, and essence? Or is it the same what Nehru was trying to say 50 years back? I just went through that 5 pages that you sent. Very, because that is a very close subject. I believe that one has to be out of religion. You should not wear religion on your sleeve. You may follow anything that you want to. But once you close your door and you come out, your religion should be left behind. I mean, that is my way of looking at it. I just want to tell you that I don't know whether you have traveled in Mumbai or not, but in Mumbai, in the middle of the night, I just want to give an example that if I am hiring an auto, and I have seen that happening in auto, a fellow auto man or a fellow, person who's driving an auto will have 99 names of Prophet Muhammad being stuck on his shield, and La ilaha and green flag and we are memes and something. Just tell me, a normal Hindu girl, if she sits in that auto, how will she tolerate the fact that every time she's looking at the path, she has to look through these names which are so intimidating? Vice versa, I've traveled in autos which has got photo of all Bhagwan, Shiv and Ram and Krishna and Brahma and everybody. And in the middle of the night, if you travel, the first thing is that you're not able to tolerate the fact that, oh my God, will he take me to my destination or will he deviate from where I want to go and harm me? So tolerating
Well,
has become so intimidating nowadays that I don't know whether we should tolerate or whether we should throw out, or whether what he said, Vino Bhave, that religion and politics are outdated. And I'm a teacher educator. I teach I guide my B.Ed students, and I'm sorry to say that I find many of them with such parochial views, and they play religion on their sleeve, that toleration is a point of content. I mean, I would say it like that. It is like that. That is what I
okay,
say. Please.
yeah. Well, from your rather elaborate anecdotal come reflective remark, I'll have only 2 or 3 things to say. One, I don't know why we should think that religious fashioning is necessarily intimidating. All right. Secondly, we have to understand that are we also saying that the absence of religion axiomatically leads us to a tolerant society? That's also a question that we have to think about. Secondly, whether the meaning of tolerance has changed. I would actually say no. From what Nehru is saying and what you find in Gandhi, they have already dealt with the 2 poles of this discussion. Nehru is struggling precisely with what you are talking about. That is the overt display of religion. And this discomfort is emerging from the fact that the modern state, I did not want to reduce my discussion to religion, but since you have brought it up, so I have to respond it to that proposition, that we have come to believe and understand, rightly so, that modern state should have nothing to do with the religion, right? So this enlightened understanding of the separation between the state and religion is a historical formation, right? And unlike in the West, where people were secularized and then they adopted a secular constitution document, here Nehru and others, in their wisdom, rightly so, considering the plurality of the society, they heralded a secular constitution and hoped that with the time people will be evolved enough in their ways to separate religion from public life as they go about, something that you are talking about. But on the critiques of secularism, who would say that it is the state that also manages the religion. Right? This is also true for our country, that the state also decides that to what extent a religious, let's say, fashioning is permissible and is not permissible. Gandhi, forget about abandoning religion or even saying that it should be separate. Gandhi, and probably I could have shared it earlier, in one of his letters, is saying that I cannot imagine politics without religion, right? And he's saying, for me, they are concomitant, they're constitutive of each other, right? So, and but the major difference is, how does Gandhi proclaim religion? What is it that he's calling religion, right? Is he calling the idea of using religion as an ideology mixing with politics? No. He's talking about religion as that which inspires the purity of faith. Let's put it like this. And it's this presence which he's talking about in relation to politics. Now, Gandhi and Nehru, of course, differed on this. Everybody knows that, right? But the fashioning of a society in Gandhi's moral universe without the presence of religion is not going to sustain itself for Gandhi, right? And that's why, as I said earlier, and his confidence is emerging from the fact that all of us as seekers of truth are imperfect, right? Unlike Nehru, whose statement on the question of religion is in fact of indifference. He says, in fact, to quote him, he says, what goes under the name of tolerance is indifference, and he in fact further goes on to say that we make a virtue of tolerance what we do not like in others, right? So you can see that as you pursue their lineages of their thought, you find that this is not a separation between religion or irreligious society, rather a separation between what informs your ethical relationship. Whether you want to build that or envision a society which is built on the principle of intimacy that is born out of truth-seeking in Gandhi, with imperfection of human life on the one hand, as against Nehru, where this is of no business to the state, and the state and everybody should be indifferent to these questions in their public life. Now, these are enduring questions. I don't have a final word to that. I have my own views. You have your own views. But I would certainly say that this would be a one-dimensional view to equate, let's say, fashioning of religious self with intimidation. That is happening not because of the fashioning, but what that fashioning does and in what context. You know what I'm saying? So there are societies where probably I'm sure even in the Western Europe, in present day France, there are people who are devout Christians. And there must be a cab guy who has a cross hanging by the rear view mirror. But people won't be afraid to get into the cab, right? They might be comfortable. That is because how do they relate? How does that image of a cab driver with the cross hanging by the rear view mirror, how does it circulate in that society, in that social imaginary? Similarly here, how does it circulate here? So we have to probably be a little more deliberative on those questions. But I'm afraid I do not want to veer into a different direction. But very important question, yes. And my opinion is that the view or understanding of tolerance has not changed. So people in the troubled times, they actually want Nehruvian vision to be restored, right? When they feel troubled by the presence of religion, right? So this is very much alive, I mean, as I would see.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, so I think we don't have any more questions. Thank you so much, Mr. Danish Iqbal, for your time and your brilliant presentation, and also engaging so well with the students and participants today. I thank you all. I will share the reflection form as usual within 10-15 minutes. So I look forward to
I would also like to, if I'm maybe allowed to formally say thanks to everyone present here. It's not an easy task to sit back and just witness someone talking incessantly. I'm not sure how well I could articulate or communicate the ideas that I had in my mind, but I enjoyed it thoroughly. And hopefully, I mean, this is a conversation that will always go on. And if not now, even later, if you are willing to engage on these concerns with me, you can reach out to me. The organizer has my email address and the phone number. So please reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to get back to you. Thanks a lot.
I would just like to say one thing. Thank you for introducing us to the philosophy of Levinas. I personally feel it was such a deep philosophy, another level of engagement with the other. So really,
I
really
also
thank
discovered
you.
him only quite recently. So yeah, but it struck a chord with the discussion. Yes, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All right. Thank you again, Mr. Danish Iqbal.